and neighborhood divided. The early evening sun cast a golden glow over the quiet suburban streets of Brookhaven Pines, a neighborhood that prided itself on its manicured lawns, pristine sidewalks, and an air of calm exclusivity. It was the kind of place where neighbors exchanged polite nods rather than meaningful conversations, and where the subtle undercurrent of unspoken boundaries ran deep. The residents lived in a bubble of perceived security, their days unmarked by anything out of the ordinary, until Marcus Carter moved in. Marcus, a tall, sharply dressed black man in his late 30s, had recently purchased a stately brick home on Magnolia Lane. His move was a quiet one, unaccompanied by the fanfare of a housewarming party or curious introductions. Most residents only noticed him as he began tidying the yard. His sleeves rolled up, revealing toned arms that hinted at a disciplined workout routine. For many, Marcus was just another homeowner, unremarkable in his routine. But not for Karen Walsh. Karen lived directly across the street, a middle-aged woman with a perpetually furrowed brow and a hawk-like gaze. She was known for her self-appointed role as the neighborhood watchdog. From her bay window, she spent her afternoons sipping tea and keeping mental tabs on her neighbors. To Karen, Marcus's presence was an anomaly, something that didn't quite fit. It wasn't just his skin color, though she'd never admit that. It was his demeanor. Marcus didn't stop to chat or wave like the other neighbors. He kept to himself, which Karen found suspicious. She watched as he carried boxes into the house one evening, his movements efficient and deliberate. He seemed too polished, too confident. The fact that she hadn't seen him with a realtor or a moving truck only added to her unease. Karen's unease turned to indignation one warm Thursday evening when she saw Marcus unloading several sleek black boxes from the trunk of his luxury sedan. He carried them into the house, pausing only to adjust his headphones. From her vantage point, Karen convinced herself that something wasn't right. She picked up her phone and dialed her best friend, Judy. "Judy, do you know anything about the man who moved into the house across from me?" Karen asked, her voice low and conspiratorial. "No idea. Why?" "I don't know, Judy. He's been moving things in and out of the house at odd hours. Doesn't he seem, I don't know, out of place to you?" Judy chuckled lightly. "Karen, not everyone has to fit into your mold. Maybe he's just busy." Karen wasn't satisfied. After ending the call, she stood at the window, her fingers gripping the curtain. Something gnawed at her, a persistent voice whispering that Marcus didn't belong. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, replaying the day's events over and over, each detail magnified under the lens of her suspicion. By morning, she convinced herself she had to act, for the safety of the neighborhood. The next afternoon, Marcus was in his driveway, polishing his car. The rhythmic motion of the cloth in his hand contrasted with the stillness of the street. He had music playing softly through a portable speaker, a soulful tune that seemed to blend with the rustle of the oak trees overhead. Karen, from her perch by the window, dialed the non-emergency police line. Her voice was steady, though tinged with self-righteousness. "Hello, yes, I'd like to report something suspicious. There's a man at 132 Magnolia Lane. I don't think he lives there. He's been unloading boxes and moving them into the house. It just doesn't seem right." The dispatcher on the other end asked a series of questions, each one met with Karen's clipped and increasingly frantic responses. Minutes later, the sound of sirens shattered the tranquil afternoon. Karen watched as a patrol car rounded the corner and came to a stop in front of Marcus's driveway. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting lightly on their holsters. Marcus looked up from his car, his expression shifting from surprise to cautious composure. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, his voice even. The officers approached, their gazes darting between Marcus and the sleek car he'd been polishing. "Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity at this address. Can you confirm if you live here?" one of them asked. Marcus straightened, setting the cloth down on the hood of the car. "I do." My name is Marcus Carter, and I purchased this home 3 weeks ago." The officers exchanged a glance. "Do you have any ID or paperwork that proves this is your property?" Marcus nodded, his movements deliberate as he reached into his back pocket for his wallet. He handed over his driver's license and the deed to the house, which he kept in his car's glove compartment for safekeeping. Karen, now standing on her porch, crossed her arms tightly. She could barely hear the exchange, but her heart raced as she tried to decipher the officer's expressions. Marcus's calm demeanor began to ease the tension. The officers handed back his documents and nodded. "Sorry for the misunderstanding, Mr. Carter. It seems everything checks out." Before they could return to their car, Karen stormed across the street. "Wait," she called out. Her face was flushed, her tone demanding. "You're just going to let him go? How do we know those papers aren't fake? I've lived here for 15 years, and I know everyone. He doesn't belong here." The officers looked at each other, visibly uncomfortable. Marcus, however, remained composed. He took a deep breath before responding. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I don't owe you an explanation. But for the record, I'm not just your neighbor. I'm also the CEO of Cartech Innovations. I believe you work there, don't you, Karen?" Karen froze, her face draining of color. The name of the company where she had been an administrative assistant for the past decade hit her like a cold wave. The officers, sensing the tension, muttered their goodbyes and left the scene. Marcus didn't wait for Karen's response. He turned and walked back into his home, leaving her standing in the street, a mix of embarrassment and disbelief etched on her face. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the quiet that returned to the neighborhood was anything but peaceful. Behind closed doors, whispers spread like wildfire, and Karen retreated into her house, unable to shake the weight of her actions. But for Marcus, the day wasn't over. He sat in his living room, staring out the window at the street that had turned into a battleground of assumptions and prejudice. He knew this was more than a misunderstanding. It was a symptom of something deeper, something he would no longer ignore. The weight of assumptions. The days following the confrontation on Magnolia Lane were heavy with a silence that felt almost oppressive. Neighbors who once waved absent-mindedly at each other now avoided eye contact. The tension lingered like a storm cloud, its presence undeniable, its origin whispered behind closed doors. Karen Walsh stayed indoors more than usual. Her walks around the neighborhood, once a daily ritual, became infrequent. She couldn't shake the humiliation that had wrapped itself around her like a second skin. Each time she peeked through her curtains and saw Marcus's house, a pang of regret mixed with indignation churned in her chest. For Marcus Carter, the aftermath was both exhausting and revealing. While he was no stranger to the subtle and overt ways prejudice manifested, this incident had struck a nerve. It wasn't the first time he'd been mistaken for someone who didn't belong, but it was the first time it happened so close to home, his sanctuary. Marcus sat at his kitchen counter one morning, sipping coffee from a sleek black mug. The steam curled lazily toward the ceiling, a sharp contrast to the turmoil in his thoughts. His phone buzzed, drawing his attention. It was a message from an old college friend, Malcolm, a civil rights attorney. Malcolm heard what happened. "You good?" Marcus sighed and typed back. "Marcus, I'm fine, but it's frustrating. Same story, different setting. Malcolm, this could be an opportunity. Use your platform. People listen to you." Marcus set the phone down, Malcolm's words resonating. He had built a reputation as a leader who valued action over words, but this wasn't the boardroom. This was personal. Meanwhile, Karen's mind raced with conflicting emotions. She couldn't deny the cold reality of what had happened. She had judged Marcus based on nothing more than her own assumptions. The fact that he turned out to be her boss, a man whose company had provided her stable income and benefits, only deepened her shame. She replayed the encounter in her mind, each moment a needle prick of self-awareness. The neighbors' sideways glances didn't help. Though no one outright confronted her, she could feel their judgment. One afternoon, Judy stopped by unannounced. Karen hesitated before letting her in, but Judy pushed past with the determined energy of a best friend who wouldn't take no for an answer. "You've been cooped up in here too long," Judy said, setting a grocery bag on the counter. "I brought snacks, and we're going to talk." Karen groaned, knowing resistance was futile. "What's there to talk about?" "Oh, I don't know," Judy said, arching a brow. "Maybe the fact that you called the cops on your boss, and the whole neighborhood knows it." Karen winced, but Judy's bluntness was one of the reasons they'd been friends for years. "Do you think I don't know how bad it looks?" Karen snapped. "It's not just how it looks, Karen. It's what it is. You need to face this, not hide from it." Karen sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood." Judy leaned forward. Protecting it from what? A man minding his own business. The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. Karen knew there was no good answer. On the other side of Magnolia Lane, Marcus was making plans. He'd spent hours researching local organizations that addressed racial bias and community accountability. He reached out to Malcolm, who connected him with a group working on community workshops aimed at dismantling unconscious bias. The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized this incident could be a turning point, not just for him, but for the neighborhood. One evening, Marcus decided to host an open meeting at his home. He printed invitations and personally delivered them to each house on the block, including Karen's. When he knocked on her door, it took a long moment before she answered. Karen opened the door cautiously, her expression a mix of embarrassment and defiance. "Hi," Marcus said, holding out the invitation. "I'm hosting a discussion about building a stronger, more inclusive community. I'd like you to come." Karen stared at the card in his hand, her heart pounding. She could hear the warmth in his voice, but it only made her feel smaller. I don't know," she stammered. "No pressure," Marcus said, stepping back. "But I think it's important, for all of us." Karen nodded silently and closed the door. She stood there for a moment, staring at the invitation. The night of the meeting, Marcus's living room buzzed with quiet conversation. A diverse group of neighbors had shown up, curiosity and apprehension etched on their faces. Marcus welcomed them with his characteristic poise, offering drinks and snacks before leading everyone into a circle. Karen arrived late, lingering in the doorway before finally taking a seat. Her presence didn't go unnoticed, but Marcus gave her a polite nod without singling her out. He began by recounting the incident, not as an accusation, but as an example of the assumptions people make. He spoke about his experiences as a black man in predominantly white spaces, weaving in statistics and personal anecdotes to illustrate the broader issue of racial bias. "This isn't about blame," Marcus said, his voice steady. "It's about awareness. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge." Karen listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For the first time, she saw Marcus not as the subject of her suspicions, but as a person with a story, a life, and a perspective she had never considered. When Marcus opened the floor for discussion, a few neighbors shared their own stories. Some admitted to having biases they were ashamed of. Others expressed a desire to learn and grow. Karen remained silent, her mind racing. But as the meeting wound down, she found herself lingering as others began to leave. Marcus approached her, his expression kind but unreadable. "Thanks for coming," he said. Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. I owe you an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "Apologies are a start. What matters is what comes next." Karen left that night with more questions than answers, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know if she could undo the damage, but she was determined to try. And so, a new chapter began, not just for Karen and Marcus, but for the neighborhood. The meeting had planted a seed, one that would take time and effort to grow. But the first step had been taken. Seeds of change. The week following Marcus's community meeting was quieter than usual in Brookhaven Pines. The meeting had ended without fireworks or dramatic declarations, but it had left an indelible mark on those who attended. Conversations shifted from small talk about lawn care and local events to whispers about the need for introspection and understanding. For some, the meeting was a wake-up call. For others, like Karen Walsh, it was a haunting reminder of the consequences of unchecked assumptions. Karen sat at her kitchen table, staring at the notes she'd hastily scribbled during the meeting. Marcus had spoken with such conviction, weaving his personal experiences with hard facts and challenges to the room. She hadn't spoken that night, unable to summon the courage to admit her wrongs in a room full of her neighbors. Now, as she replayed his words, guilt gnawed at her insides. She had spent her life priding herself on being a good person, someone who followed the rules and believed in fairness. But the incident with Marcus had forced her to confront a truth she wasn't ready to admit. Her actions had been driven by bias, and that bias had real consequences. Across the street, Marcus was working late in his home office. The glow from his laptop illuminated his thoughtful expression as he typed out an email to his team. The meeting had gone better than he'd expected, but he knew one meeting wouldn't change deeply ingrained mindsets. He paused and looked out the window at the quiet street. This neighborhood, like so many others, was a microcosm of the larger world. The biases, assumptions, and fears that had surfaced here were reflections of systemic issues he'd faced his entire life. But Marcus wasn't one to dwell on problems without seeking solutions. He opened another tab on his computer and began researching community building programs. He came across an organization that focused on creating spaces for difficult conversations about race and bias. They offered workshops and guided discussions, tailored to neighborhoods like his. Marcus bookmarked the page, already forming a plan to bring the initiative to Brookhaven Pines. That Saturday, Karen decided to take a bold step. Armed with a batch of homemade cookies, a small olive branch, she crossed the street and rang Marcus's doorbell. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited, the plate trembling slightly in her hands. When Marcus opened the door, he looked momentarily surprised but quickly recovered, offering a polite smile. "Karen," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "Come in." She hesitated, unsure if she deserved his kindness, but she stepped inside. Marcus led her to the living room, where the open floor plan made her feel simultaneously exposed and welcome. "I brought these," she said, holding out the plate. I wanted to apologize again. For everything." Marcus took the plate and set it on the coffee table. "Thank you. I appreciate that." Karen clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I was wrong, Marcus. There's no excuse for what I did. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. And I hurt you. I hurt this community." Marcus regarded her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Acknowledging that is a good start," he said. "But apologies are only meaningful if they lead to action." Karen nodded vigorously. "I want to do better. I want to learn. I don't know where to start." Marcus leaned back, his gaze steady. "Start by listening, by asking questions, even when it's uncomfortable, and by recognizing that growth isn't a straight line. It's messy, and it takes time." They talked for nearly an hour, Karen asking questions about Marcus's experiences and listening as he spoke candidly about the challenges he'd faced as a black man in corporate America and beyond. By the time she left, Karen felt both humbled and motivated. The next week, Marcus reached out to the community organization he'd found online and scheduled a workshop for the neighborhood. He sent out invitations, this time with a personal note encouraging each household to attend. On the day of the workshop, Marcus transformed his living room into a makeshift meeting space. Chairs were arranged in a circle, and a projector was set up to display slides. The facilitators, a dynamic duo named Angela and Louis, arrived early to prepare. As neighbors trickled in, there was a palpable mix of curiosity and apprehension. Karen arrived with Judy, both women exchanging nervous glances. Angela started the workshop with an icebreaker, asking everyone to share one thing they loved about the neighborhood. The responses ranged from the peaceful streets to the friendly waves of passing neighbors. It was a simple exercise, but it set the tone for what was to come. The facilitators guided the group through a series of activities designed to uncover and address unconscious biases. One activity involved writing down the first 3 words that came to mind when they heard certain phrases like new neighbor or business owner. The results sparked uncomfortable but necessary conversations. Karen found herself speaking up for the first time, sharing how her assumptions about Marcus had been shaped by stereotypes she hadn't even realized she carried. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but Marcus gave her an encouraging nod, which bolstered her confidence. By the end of the workshop, the room felt lighter, as though a collective weight had been lifted. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before were now exchanging stories and ideas, building bridges where there had once been walls. As the attendees filtered out, Karen lingered. She approached Marcus, her expression earnest. "Thank you for doing this," she said. "It's opened my eyes in ways I didn't expect." Marcus smiled. "It's a start, Karen. The real work begins now." Karen nodded, knowing he was right. She walked home with a sense of purpose, determined to turn her newfound awareness into meaningful change. Marcus watched her go, feeling the glimmer of hope for the first time since the incident. Change, he knew, wasn't easy, but it was possible. And in this small neighborhood, a seed of change had been planted. Confronting the past, Karen sat at her dining table, a stack of books and printouts spread before her. The workshop had stirred something inside her, a gnawing need to understand not only Marcus's experiences, but also the broader context of systemic bias and racial injustice. Her late-night searches had led her down a rabbit hole of articles, documentaries, and personal stories. Each new piece of information felt like a puzzle clicking into place, revealing an ugly truth she had spent much of her life oblivious to. She picked up a worn copy of The New Jim Crow, one of the books recommended during the workshop. The words on the page pulled her into a world she had never been forced to confront, a world where systemic racism wasn't just an abstract concept, but a pervasive, destructive force. She thought back to her own upbringing in a small, predominantly white town. The unspoken rules and whispered judgments of her childhood now felt glaringly clear in hindsight. Her thoughts drifted to Marcus, his calm demeanor and willingness to engage despite the hurt she had caused. She wondered if she would have shown the same grace if their roles were reversed. Karen closed the book and glanced at the clock. It was almost time for the neighborhood's newly formed discussion group to meet, a follow-up to Marcus's workshop. She had volunteered to host this one, a small but meaningful step toward mending the rift she had caused. The living room of Karen's home had been rearranged to accommodate the group. Folding chairs formed a loose circle, and a table near the entrance held coffee, tea, and a plate of cookies Karen had baked that morning. As neighbors began to arrive, the room filled with a mix of chatter and nervous energy. Marcus arrived last, his presence commanding but not intimidating. He greeted Karen with a warm smile and a nod, then took a seat near the window. Karen cleared her throat to start the meeting. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "After the workshop Marcus hosted, I realized how much I still have to learn. I hope these meetings can be a space for us to share, listen, and grow together." The group murmured their agreement, and the discussion began. Each person was encouraged to share a personal story or reflection about bias, whether it was something they had experienced, witnessed, or even perpetuated. One neighbor, an elderly man named Tom, recounted a story from his youth. "When I was a kid, my parents told me not to play with the Johnsons' kids because they were different. I didn't understand it then, but now I see how those attitudes shaped my thinking for years." Another neighbor, Maria, shared her frustrations as a Latina woman constantly being asked where she was really from, despite having been born and raised in the United States. When it was Karen's turn, she took a deep breath. "I'm ashamed to admit this, but I'm here because of a mistake I made, one that hurt Marcus and this community. I assumed the worst about him without knowing anything about him. I let my fears and biases take over, and I'm deeply sorry for that." The room was silent as Karen spoke, her vulnerability palpable. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging nod. "But I don't want to stop at an apology," Karen continued. "I want to do better. And I want us all to hold each other accountable, so we can create a community where everyone feels welcome." As the meeting wrapped up, the atmosphere in the room felt lighter, more open. Neighbors lingered to chat, exchanging phone numbers and ideas for future discussions. Karen approached Marcus as he stood by the door, his coat draped over his arm. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Marcus studied her for a moment before replying. "You're trying, Karen, and that matters. Just remember, this isn't a sprint. It's a marathon." Karen nodded, his words sinking in. "I'm in it for the long haul," she promised. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts about the meeting, the stories her neighbors had shared, and the work that still lay ahead. She got out of bed and went to her desk, where a notebook lay open. She began to write, not just her reflections, but a plan. She listed ideas for community initiatives, a book club focused on diversity and inclusion, a neighborhood newsletter to highlight different cultural traditions, and a mentorship program to support local youth. Her pen paused as she thought of Marcus. She knew she couldn't undo the harm she had caused, but she could make sure her actions going forward contributed to healing and growth. Meanwhile, across the street, Marcus was reflecting on the evening as well. He sat on his porch, a cup of herbal tea warming his hands as he stared at the quiet street. He thought about Karen's transformation and the way the neighborhood was beginning to shift. Change wasn't easy, he knew that. It was often slow, uncomfortable, and met with resistance, but tonight had given him hope. For every Karen who was willing to confront her biases, there were countless others who might be inspired to do the same. He picked up his phone and opened an email draft he had been working on. It was an invitation to a citywide forum on community building, a chance to share the progress being made in Brookhaven Pines and to inspire other neighborhoods to follow suit. Marcus smiled as he hit send. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a while, it felt like the journey was worth it. As the days turned into weeks, the neighborhood of Brookhaven Pines began to look a little different. Neighbors who had once been strangers started greeting each other by name. Small acts of kindness, like shoveling a driveway or bringing over a home-cooked meal, became more frequent. Karen found herself at the heart of these efforts, organizing events and fostering connections she had once taken for granted. And though she still had moments of self-doubt, she pushed forward, determined to be a part of the change she wanted to see. For Marcus, watching the transformation unfold was both rewarding and humbling. He had set out to address a single incident, but in doing so, he had sparked a movement that was changing lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. The seeds of change had been planted, and with each passing day, they continued to grow. A new vision for Brookhaven Pines. The days following the second community meeting marked a turning point in Brookhaven Pines. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had evolved into a collective reckoning, sparking a wave of small but meaningful changes in the neighborhood. Karen found herself at the center of these efforts. Once a passive observer of life around her, she now actively sought ways to foster connection and understanding. She dove headfirst into planning community events, reaching out to neighbors she had barely spoken to before. Her growing determination wasn't just about making amends. It was about creating a neighborhood where everyone felt seen, valued, and safe. This newfound purpose had transformed Karen's daily routine. She began each morning with a notebook in hand, jotting down ideas for initiatives that could bring neighbors together. A neighborhood potluck, a book club with a focus on diverse authors, a community garden where residents could share space and stories. But Karen knew she couldn't do it alone. Across the street, Marcus Carter was similarly deep in thought. He had spent the morning fielding emails from colleagues and community leaders, many of whom had heard about the changes brewing in Brookhaven Pines. Word of the neighborhood's transformation had begun to spread, and Marcus found himself juggling requests for interviews and speaking engagements. Despite the demands on his time, Marcus made it a point to stay rooted in the community. He attended every meeting, offered guidance when needed, and continued to share his story with an honesty that inspired others. When Karen reached out to ask for his help in planning the neighborhood's first-ever diversity celebration, he didn't hesitate. "It's a great idea," Marcus said during their planning meeting, held at his home one Saturday afternoon. Karen nodded, flipping through a binder filled with notes and sketches. "I want it to be more than just food and entertainment. I want it to mean something, to show that we're serious about change." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her. He could see how much effort she was putting into this, and it was clear that her intentions were genuine. "Let's start by focusing on education," he suggested. "We could have booths or stations where people can learn about different cultures, maybe even speakers who can share their personal experiences." Karen's eyes lit up. "I love that idea. And maybe we can partner with local artists to showcase their work, something that celebrates diversity in every form." As they brainstormed, the energy in the room grew infectious. By the time Karen left, she was brimming with excitement, her mind racing with possibilities. The weeks leading up to the event were a flurry of activity. Karen and Marcus worked closely with a team of neighbors to bring the vision to life. Flyers were distributed, local vendors were invited, and volunteers signed up to run various stations. One of the most impactful additions was a storytelling booth, where residents could share personal anecdotes about moments that had shaped their understanding of identity, community, and bias. Marcus offered to share his own story, setting the tone for others to follow. The day of the celebration arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze. Magnolia Lane had been transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. Colorful banners hung from streetlights, and booths lined the sidewalks, each one representing a different culture or cause. Neighbors arrived in droves, many bringing friends and family from outside the community. The scent of spices and fresh-baked goods filled the air, mingling with the sound of laughter and music. At the center of it all stood Marcus and Karen, working together to ensure everything ran smoothly. Karen moved from booth to booth, checking on volunteers and engaging with visitors. At one station, she paused to listen as a local artist explained the symbolism behind her work. The artist, a young black woman named Ayanna, spoke passionately about how art had given her a voice in spaces where she often felt invisible. Hearing Ayanna's story brought tears to Karen's eyes. It was a powerful reminder of why this event mattered, not just for the neighborhood, but for her own journey of growth. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus took the stage to address the crowd. He stood behind a small podium, his confident presence commanding attention. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "This event is more than just a celebration. It's a testament to what we can achieve when we come together, not despite our differences, but because of them." He paused, scanning the sea of faces before him. Brookhaven Pines is changing. We're changing. And while we still have a long way to go, I believe we're on the right path. It's not enough to say we want a better community. We have to work for it every day. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy palpable. When Marcus stepped down from the stage, Karen was waiting for him. She extended a hand, her smile genuine. "You were amazing," she said. Marcus shook her hand, his own smile warm. "So were you. None of this would have happened without your efforts." Karen shook her head. "I couldn't have done it without you, without all of us." As the event wound down and neighbors began to pack up, there was a sense of optimism in the air. The celebration had been a success, not just in its execution, but in its impact. Conversations had been sparked, connections had been strengthened, and the foundation for a more inclusive community had been laid. For Karen, the day felt like a turning point. She knew her journey wasn't over, but she felt more confident than ever in her ability to contribute to meaningful change. And for Marcus, it was a reaffirmation of the power of resilience and community. As he stood on his porch that evening, watching the last of the decorations come down, he felt a sense of pride in what they had accomplished together. Brookhaven Pines was no longer just a neighborhood. It was becoming a community, one that celebrated its diversity and faced its challenges head-on. Bridging the divide. The evening sky over Brookhaven Pines was painted in hues of deep orange and purple as the diversity celebration came to an end. The faint hum of laughter and conversation lingered in the air, a reminder of the connections forged throughout the day. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive, not with superficial pleasantries, but with a genuine sense of belonging. Karen Walsh stood on her front porch, watching the last of the volunteers pack up the remaining booths. Her mind buzzed with a mix of exhaustion and pride. The day had gone better than she could have imagined, and the feedback from neighbors had been overwhelmingly positive. Yet, as the adrenaline of the event faded, a quiet resolve settled over her. This was only the beginning. Across the street, Marcus Carter sat in his home office, reflecting on the day. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and friends who had attended or heard about the celebration. The event's success had far exceeded his expectations, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not for himself, but for the community that had come together. As he leaned back in his chair, his mind wandered to the larger picture. Change had begun in Brookhaven Pines, but Marcus knew this was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The systemic issues that fueled bias and division couldn't be dismantled overnight. But if a single neighborhood could transform, perhaps others could too. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Marcus rose to answer it and found Karen standing there, a notebook tucked under her arm. "Hi, Marcus," she said, offering a tentative smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Marcus replied, stepping aside to let her in. Karen glanced around the living room, which still bore traces of the day's events. A folded banner on the coffee table, a stack of name tags on the counter. "I just wanted to say thank you," she began, her voice earnest, "for everything. The workshop, the celebration, and your patience with me." Marcus gestured for her to sit, his expression thoughtful. "Karen, you don't have to keep thanking me. What matters is what you're doing now. And you've done a lot." Karen sat down, her grip tightening on the notebook. "It still doesn't feel like enough. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that real change takes consistent effort. I want to keep going, to make sure this isn't just a one-time thing." She opened the notebook and slid it across the table toward Marcus. Inside were detailed notes and sketches of ideas for future initiatives, a mentorship program for local youth, regular community workshops, and even a plan for a scholarship fund supported by neighborhood donations. Marcus flipped through the pages, impressed by the thought and effort Karen had put into her plans. "This is ambitious," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Karen nodded. "I know, but I think we can do it, if we work together." Marcus leaned back, considering her words. He had always believed in the power of collaboration, and Karen's determination was inspiring. "I'm in," he said finally, a smile spreading across his face. Karen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you. I'll need all the help I can get." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Karen and Marcus worked tirelessly to turn her ideas into reality, enlisting the help of neighbors and local organizations. The mentorship program launched first, pairing young people in the community with professionals who could guide them in their education and careers. Karen was particularly proud of the scholarship fund. She reached out to local businesses and secured several sponsorships, ensuring that the fund would have a strong start. Marcus used his corporate connections to spread the word, bringing in additional support from outside the neighborhood. As these initiatives took shape, the impact on Brookhaven Pines became increasingly evident. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now gathered regularly for planning meetings and events. The community newsletter became a space for residents to share stories, celebrate milestones, and highlight local talent. One crisp autumn evening, the neighborhood came together for a dinner under the stars, hosted in Marcus's spacious backyard. Long tables were set up, adorned with twinkling lights and floral centerpieces. Residents brought dishes from their cultural backgrounds, creating a vibrant tapestry of flavors and aromas. As the evening unfolded, Karen stood at the edge of the gathering, taking it all in. The laughter, the shared stories, the warmth. It was everything she had hoped for when she first approached Marcus with her plans. Marcus joined her, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider. He handed one to Karen and raised his own in a toast. "To progress," he said. Karen smiled and clinked her glass against his. "To community," she added. In the months that followed, Brookhaven Pines became a model for other neighborhoods. Stories of its transformation were featured in local news outlets, and Marcus and Karen were invited to speak at community forums. For Marcus, it was a chance to share his vision for a more inclusive society, one where people confronted their biases and worked together to create meaningful change. For Karen, it was an opportunity to show that growth was possible, even for those who had made mistakes. Their partnership became a symbol of what could happen when people chose empathy over fear, action over apathy. As winter set in and the streets of Brookhaven Pines sparkled with holiday lights, the neighborhood felt more connected than ever. Children played together without hesitation, families exchanged homemade gifts, and the community continued to thrive. Karen and Marcus often reflected on how far they had come, not just as individuals, but as a community. Their journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. On a quiet evening, as snow began to fall, Marcus looked out his window at the glowing lights of the neighborhood. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that Brookhaven Pines had become more than just a collection of houses. It was a home. And for Karen, who stood on her own porch watching the same snowfall, the transformation of Brookhaven Pines was a reminder of the power of change, not just in others, but in herself. As the snow dusted the rooftops and lawns of Brookhaven Pines, Karen sat in her living room, sipping hot cocoa and flipping through a photo album she'd started compiling after the diversity celebration. Each photo captured moments of joy and connection, neighbors laughing over shared meals, children learning together during the mentorship sessions, and even candid shots of Marcus speaking at community events. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her from her reverie. It was a text from Marcus. "Marcus. Hey, just checking in. You good?" Karen smiled at the simplicity of the message. It wasn't just about the day-to-day. It was about the friendship that had grown between them, a bond forged through vulnerability, effort, and mutual respect. Karen. Better than good. Just looking through the photos from the celebration. Can't believe how far we've come. A few moments later, her phone buzzed again. Marcus. We've come far, but there's still more to do. Let's meet tomorrow. Got a new idea to run by you. Karen felt a pang of excitement. The work they had started wasn't just a project. It had become a shared purpose, something that gave her days meaning. The next morning, Karen and Marcus met at a cozy cafe on the edge of town. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of soft jazz created a warm atmosphere as they settled into a booth. Marcus pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. "I've been thinking," he began, tapping his pen on the edge of the page. "What if we expanded the mentorship program? We've already made an impact locally, but what if we partnered with other neighborhoods?" Karen's eyes lit up, like a network of communities working together. "Exactly," Marcus said. "We could create a model based on what's worked here in Brookhaven Pines and use it to help other neighborhoods build stronger, more inclusive connections." Karen nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "We'd need to build a team, find funding, and—" Marcus interrupted with a chuckle. "One step at a time, Karen. Let's start with a proposal and see where it goes." Their conversation stretched into the afternoon as they sketched out their vision. By the time they left the cafe, they had a clear plan for their next steps. Over the following months, Marcus and Karen worked tirelessly to bring their vision to life. They reached out to community leaders, local organizations, and even city officials, sharing the success story of Brookhaven Pines as a blueprint for change. Their efforts culminated in the launch of the Neighborhood Empowerment Network, NEN, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering inclusivity and collaboration in communities across the region. The initiative gained momentum quickly, attracting volunteers, donors, and media attention. Karen took on the role of community liaison, using her newfound confidence and passion to build relationships and bridge gaps. Marcus served as the organization's director, his leadership and experience guiding the team through challenges and growth. 1 year after the first diversity celebration in Brookhaven Pines, the neighborhood gathered once again for another milestone event. This time, a celebration of the launch of the NEN. The evening was filled with speeches, music, and heartfelt stories of transformation. Karen took the stage, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "I used to think change was something that happened to other people," she said, her gaze sweeping over the audience. "But I've learned that change starts with us, with the choices we make, the conversations we have, and the actions we take. Brookhaven Pines taught me that, and I'm grateful every day for the chance to grow alongside all of you." The crowd erupted into applause, and Karen stepped down, her heart full. Marcus took the stage next, his words carrying the same quiet strength that had inspired the community from the beginning. "This isn't just about one neighborhood," he said. "It's about creating a ripple effect, about showing that when we come together with open hearts and open minds, we can build something extraordinary. Brookhaven Pines is proof of that, and I can't wait to see what we accomplish next." The event ended with a shared meal under the stars, a tradition that had become a symbol of unity in the neighborhood. As the night wound down, Karen and Marcus stood side by side, watching the crowd. "You know," Karen said, her voice thoughtful, "if you told me a year ago that this is where we'd end up, I wouldn't have believed you." Marcus smiled. "A lot can change in a year." Karen turned to him, her expression serious. "Thank you, Marcus, for everything. For your patience, your guidance, and for not giving up on me or this neighborhood." Marcus met her gaze, his smile widening. "Thank you, Karen, for choosing to step up when it would have been easier to walk away." They stood in comfortable silence, the hum of laughter and conversation around them a testament to the progress they had made. Brookhaven Pines wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a beacon of hope, a place where differences were celebrated, and challenges were met with determination and compassion. As Karen and Marcus looked out at the community they had helped shape, they knew their journey was far from over. But they also knew that together, they could face whatever came next. And for the first time, both of them felt certain that the best was yet to come.